Hey, good morning to anyone who finds this. I'm rereading old books from my bookshelf because there's not a lot else to do. And I thought I would post some videos just sort of like summarizing books. Anyway, so the first book I picked is Incognito, David Eagleman, The Secret Lives of the Brain. This is a book about neuroscience. I picked this kind of randomly just because it's like a short, relatively short book, and I read it a very long time ago and I wanted to remember more about it, and I remember thinking it was kind of interesting. So it's written by this guy, David Eagleman. He's a neuroscientist, so he's like an academic. He gets published, or has been published a few times. And I think he kind of buries the lead a little bit. I think the sort of main thing that he says is back here, when he says, basically he says that neuroscience is a field of question marks, right? Like, we really don't know that much what's going on. I think like there are a lot of fields of science where we do have a pretty good picture of like how a lot of aspects of it work. You throw a ball up, you know what's going to happen next. And maybe obviously I think like brain science is not really like that. We have an understanding of like neurons and how like they work on a cellular level, and then we have kind of an understanding of humans and like, if you poke someone, what they do. But there's like a huge gap between there of how we get from like neurons to patches of neural tissue, whatever, all the way up to a brain. And we really don't know that much about it. So I'm glad that he's saying this. I'm glad that he'll admit that. I think that's very honest as a neuroscientist, and like academics usually don't say stuff like this, especially like this. There's great pressure on scientists applied from granting agencies and popular media to pretend like the major problems are about to be solved at any moment. I think that's very true, and I'm glad he said that. Another thing, though, he says, there's this kind of framework that there should be a complete scientific objective account of the world, and that we haven't really gotten there yet. And this is definitely a viewpoint that I used to believe in really strongly, and care a lot about. And I think my faith in this idea is definitely less than it was, like, let's say 10 years ago. And he definitely writes this book sort of with this idea in mind, that there should be sort of a single objective view of the world, and that the goal is to get closer to that objective view. But anyway, let's actually talk about the neuroscience. So the first thing that he really talks about, the first sort of like thrust of the book, is about the conscious versus unconscious brain. And he, I think everyone has kind of a model sort of like this, or, this is something that we all talk about a lot, that there's like the conscious brain, and there's like a big aspect of your brain activity, just body activity, that's really not, you don't have any control over, you don't even really have awareness of. So, you can obviously, like, breathing and blinking kind of happen automatically, but you can control them sometimes. But then there's also just, like, all of the stuff that goes on in, like, your digestive tract. And he gives the example of, like, when you move your arm, your muscles are, like, expanding and contracting, and that's controlled by nerves, which are just neurons, which are controlled by more nerves, and it goes back up to you. And also, I think that's an important point too, is that we think of a brain often as just like this thing that's in your head, and then it just like has command over everything else. But neural tissue is everywhere in your body, and you think about like a lobster, where there's no like central nervous system. It's kind of like just the neural tissue is distributed, and a brain is really just kind of like a lump of neurons. And it's like a pretty unique thing where instead of the neurons like affecting the movement of muscles directly, they just all sort of affect each other and then eventually affect muscles later. But basically the argument that he makes here is that, it's not just like conscious, subconscious, like it's not just sort of the 50-50 thing. His argument is basically that the conscious brain is an extremely, extremely tiny portion of all of the activity that goes on in your brain. And he uses this analogy that I actually kind of like, which is this newspaper analogy. So he's saying, consider the activity that characterizes a nation at any moment. He's comparing your body to like a full society, right? Where factories churn, telecommunication lines buzz with activity, businesses ship products, people eat constantly, sewer lines, Okay, you can't take in all the information at once. You want a summary. You don't want to know that Congress just signed a bill. You want to be alerted if there's a spike of mad cow disease. You care if workers are going on strike, So his metaphor here is that your conscious mind is that newspaper. You're sort of just getting a summary of all the top level activity. All of the low level stuff, just like moving your fingers and stuff, is kind of happening without you noticing it. And then it's really just like the top level decision making processes or whatever that get reported. And he also later in the book sort of uses a different analogy, which is a CEO analogy. And that's this idea that your consciousness is like a CEO that directs all the activity of the brain. So now your body is like a company instead of a country. And, you know, you have most of the stuff operates, most of the parts of the company operate sort of automatically. You know, the people who are doing the sort of low level stuff are sort of carrying out these pre-programmed routines. And then it's only every once in a while that sort of the CEO comes in and makes a big decision, which either makes things better or fucks everything up, whatever. I think these are both, I think, interesting analogies, and they're both very kind of different ways of looking at the picture, right? In the newspaper version, it's very passive. There's not really any room for free will. You're kind of just like watching your life like a movie. And in the CEO one, there's clearly some kind of like agency or direction going on there. Anyway, I think these are both interesting analogies, both useful models in different contexts. The example he gives here for the CEO thing, when people play... let me get this working better. When people play a video game for the first time, their brains are alive with activity. They're burning energy like crazy. As they get better at the game, less brain activity is involved. They become more energy efficient. So basically he's saying consciousness is only called into the party when it's needed, right? And most of the time, if you're doing something routine, you know, if you're like waking up in the middle of the night to like go to the bathroom, when you're turning that doorknob, you're not really like conscious of that. It's sort of all happening pretty automatically. You're not burning too much glucose in your brain. So I think that's all well and good. The next thing he spends a lot of time talking about is sort of the construction of reality in the brain. So he uses a bunch of like these optical illusions. Like, should have bookmarked this. Whatever, this one is interesting. It's showing where this is a subject whose eyes were being tracked, and it's showing where in this painting they looked when they were asked different things. So this is just when they were like free, asked to just look at the picture however they wanted. Then they were asked how rich the family was, and they looked at the clothing. Then they asked how old they were, they looked at the faces. My favorite one was they asked how long it's been since they saw each other. And now they look at the faces again, but you can see they're like panning back and forth to like look at the relationship between the people. I think that's really cool. And basically, you know, he makes a bunch of arguments of what I think is a pretty familiar idea if you've seen any of these kind of like optical illusion things, which is that your brain takes in a bunch of light and sound and all this stuff, and then just processes it into like, that's a table, that's a person, that's something scary, that's something delicious, right? And that kind of all happens at a completely subconscious level, and then you kind of really believe, you know, whatever, when you see green, we invent green, right? Green is like a wavelength of light. That's just like a pattern of vibrations, and we make it green in our head. And that's something that I think we all know, generally speaking, but he talks about it in a pretty interesting way, and I think specifically because he talks about some examples of people with neurological differences, like people who had strokes and their brain functioning now is like slightly different. And it's this one example that he gives, which I thought was like super fascinating, was, I didn't know anything about this, Anton syndrome. And this is a syndrome where people who have had a stroke believe that they're not blind. So they're blind, they don't have any physical input from their eyes, but they believe that they're not blind. So he talks about a group of doctors will stand around the bedside and say, Mrs. Johnson, how many of us are on the bed? And she'll answer 4, even though there are in fact 7 of them. A doctor will say, Mrs. Johnson, how many fingers am I holding up? She'll say 3. Well, in fact, he's holding up none. They ask what color is my shirt. She says white and it's blue. So this is fucking crazy to me. This really sort of threw me, which is the idea that they're experiencing like what they take to be vision, but it's all internally generated. That is like wild, right? So I know that like reality is fabricated in the brain, but the idea that you could really have like no input, like no actual input, and that sort of like reality creation machine is still operating and is still giving you like a scene, that is super wild to me. And then he personally, like, I think, this seems like a kind of like fictionalized version of the story, but then he gives a specific example of when he was talking to someone who had this or like a similar situation. What is this? So this was, I think, my favorite example in the book, just because it comes from his personal experience. And so this guy, David Eagleman, was working with a patient who had had a stroke recently and had brain tissue damage. And basically, when this woman was asked to close her eyes, and she would only close one and not the other, but she believed that both eyes were closed. So David says, "Are your eyes closed?" "Yes," she says. "Both eyes?" "Yes." And I held up 3 fingers. "How many fingers am I holding up?" 3, she said. "And your eyes are closed?" "Yes." So he says, "Then how did you know how many fingers I was holding up?" An interesting silence followed. So basically, she believes that her eyes are closed, but she also knows that he's holding up 3 fingers. And she's like, how can I work this out, right? How can I make this make sense? And he takes her to a mirror. He says, "Okay, close both your eyes." Again, she closes just one eye. He says, "Are both your eyes closed?" "Yes." "Can you see yourself?" "Yes." Gently, I said, "Does it seem possible to see yourself in the mirror if both your eyes are closed?" And she just doesn't respond. I think that's so, like, crazy to me. That's like, he says, "Does it look to you like one eye is closed or that both are closed?" No conclusion. So yeah, when you have different parts of your brain that are telling you like completely conflicting information, you really can just sort of have like a lockout or like a lock, whatever, something like doesn't really click there. And that's, you have one part of your brain that's saying, "I see 3 fingers," and another part of your brain is saying, "But I know for a fact that both my eyes are closed." Anyway, that is wild to me. Okay, the last main section of this book, I don't really want to talk that much about, because I think he says a lot of stuff that I really didn't like, and I thought was like pretty atrocious, actually. So he talks a lot about like neuroscience and law, and the extent to, he starts right out by talking about lobotomies, right? And he sort of has this approach where, he's clearly anti-lobotomy, but he's definitely like wants to find a way that you can use neuroscience to like quote unquote fix people. Also, the way that he talks about neurological differences throughout the book is very much this idea that there's a correct way for your brain to work. There's sort of like this rationality idea, and that anyone who differs from that or deviates from that is like, it's wrong. Anyway, so the part about lobotomies was really just like, he talks about, so this is the dude who invented lobotomies, and he, you cut the fucking brain with a scalpel. And so this dude tested it out on several criminals and found to his satisfaction that it calmed them down. In fact, it flattened their personalities entirely. His student, Walter Freeman, noticed that saw lobotomy as an expedient tool to liberate large populations from treatment and back into private life. So I just think that David is maybe being too trusting of scientists and people in lab coats. I don't think lobotomy was ever really intended as a treatment to help people. My understanding of lobotomies, from what he gives the example of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is fictional, but there are obviously a bunch of real-world examples of this that we just don't know people's names. But lobotomies, I think, were always sort of intended as a punishment or as a way to like subdue and suppress people, and I think it was branded as like a treatment. But I don't think that, I don't believe that Moniz, or whatever this guy's name, Walter Freeman, I don't believe these people had good intentions or innocent intentions necessarily. I think definitely they wrote the papers as if they did. But, then he does this weird thing, David does this weird thing, where he kind of like, I don't think he actually believes this, but he sort of like acts as if he might, or that it's a reasonable thing to believe, where he says, but if the lobotomy stops the crime, why not do it? The ethical problem pivots on how much a state should be able to change its citizens. So that to me is really awful, and he goes on and on about a lot of things related to this. Something that's actually kind of scary is that in his bio it says that he works for the Initiative on Neuroscience and Law. So I'm not really into this. I think this is kind of just a good example of how scientists, especially like white men scientists, tend to be allowed to sort of just talk about, with authority, talk about whatever they want, even if they haven't really it's not their specialty. It's, or not even not their specialty. It's just something that they don't even know about. They haven't really read about it. I have a couple examples of this. He does this throughout the book, and I think if you're a neuroscientist and your whole life people are telling you you're super smart, then you kind of just assume you know everything. I don't, he talks a lot about law and the legal system and how we should punish criminals, and I just don't think he's really read much about the criminal justice system in America. It definitely doesn't show in his writing. He also talks about, he has one of these models that I'm very familiar with, but I don't think is very useful. This idea of the brain as divided between reason and emotion. I think this is also kind of like an outdated and kind of sexist framework, where you have like rationality represented by the sort of masculine side, and then you have your feminine side that's like swayed by the changes in the tides and the hormones and things like this. And that's how lobotomies were used on women with quote unquote hysteria, to sort of like subdue them. So yeah, again, I don't think this is based in reality. I had some other examples of this. What else? Oh yeah, he makes the art. He's trying to give examples of how genes affect behavior, and he's talking about how violent crimes, you're much more likely to commit violent crimes if you have a Y chromosome. And I think while that's literally factually true, I don't think you commit assault because you have a Y chromosome. I think you commit assault because you're socialized as a man. He's confusing sex and gender there. And then the last part, which I really don't want to go too far into, is he talks about IQ and he's the myth of human equality. I mean, he literally has a section of his book called The Myth of Human Equality. So I wish he would have done more research on this before he wrote this. He says this thing that I think a lot of scientisty people believe: along any axis that we measure human beings, we discover a wide-ranging distribution. So again, in the most literal sense, that's true, that when you measure people on an axis, you get a bell curve. But I think there's like the bigger problem then of, I think most meaningful aspects of the human experience can't really be measured on an axis. And then the even more problematic thing, which is that when people are measured on an axis, usually that is sort of like a precursor to sorting people according to that axis, like in a social setting. And that I think is really dangerous. You sort of like take this conceptual axis and you reproduce it in reality, and you create like real inequality between people based in this like conception of inequality. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff here that I think is problematic, but again, the sort of main points that he makes here, that there's sort of, I think that he argues that neuroscience is a field of question marks, consciousness is just like the tip of a huge iceberg, and that reality is a construction of the mind. I think that's all very more or less valid, or more or less what I believe and agree with. And then just to end with like a random little bonus thing, not related to the book at all, but just this example he used makes me like, I definitely need to read a book about Joan of Arc. Consider Joan of Arc the 16-year-old girl who managed to turn the tide of the 100 Years' War because she believed and convinced the French soldiers that she was hearing voices. I forgot she was 16. That's a pretty insane story that I like would love to dive deeper into, also because like I don't remember shit about the 100 Years' War. Anyway, that's this book, Incognito, David Eagleman. I'll try to post something tomorrow too.